Thank you for joining us for the Biological Medicine Approach to Hormonal Cancers with Dr. Melina Roberts. Dr. Roberts is a leading authority and international lecturer on optimizing health from the microbiome and microenvironment to complex chronic disease. She specializes in European biological medicine for treating women's health, autoimmune disease, hormonal balancing, pediatrics, digestive disorders, chronic complex disease, and natural cancer treatments, which is one of the things she'll be focusing on tonight. Dr. Roberts has a published book, Building a Healthy Child, and she's written numerous articles, including in the Clinical Journal of Sports Medicine and the Townsend Newsletter and Alive magazine. She also hosts a podcast called Building Health with Dr. Melina Roberts, and this is ranked in the top 30 of the naturopathic YouTube stations. Dr. Roberts always has so much to share and such good clinical information, so this is definitely going to be another excellent webinar. So with that said, I'm going to pass the floor over to Dr. Roberts.
Thank you so much for having me. And for being here, because I think that, we all have really busy schedules, so I appreciate you being here and taking the time to listen to this. This is definitely a topic that I see a lot of in my practice in terms of hormonal cancers, so I'm looking forward to sharing this information for you. This is jam-packed, so I'm going to try to move through as quickly as I can, but making sure that you still understand what I'm saying as we go through, so not trying to race through too fast. All right, so this is a little bit about me. Heather did a wonderful job in terms of introducing me here. Probably the newest thing I can add to my resume here is that I went and did I'm a TEDx speaker, so I went and did a TEDx talk in New York City a few weeks ago during COVID, so it was an interesting adventure, but hopefully that will be uploaded soon and I can share that talk with you guys. So these are just a list of some of the different hormonal cancers out there. The list is definitely more extensive than this, but this is just kind of a summary of some of those hormonal cancers we tend to see in practice. Breast cancer and prostate cancer are definitely the more common ones that we see. And just to kind of go through what the prevalence of these different cancers are. So in terms of the top ones that you tend to see in the Western world is lung cancer, but then you'll see that breast cancer and prostate cancer are, hitting 2 and 3 in terms of the most common ones that we see in our Western world. Now, the conventional approach to treating cancer is really focused on the tumor. We really just focus on the tumor, and in terms of that conventional approach, everything revolves around the tumor. And what we do is we use different therapies to remove that tumor. So you're either going to surgically remove it, you're going to chemically remove it with chemotherapy, you're going to use radiation and burn that tumor. And if we destroy this tumor, then it's considered that cancer is gone. And you're focusing on those 3 main tools, which is the chemotherapy, radiation, surgery. And according to the conventional model, those are the only therapies that can treat cancer. Now, a biological medicine approach to cancer is, I'd say, very different, because what we see cancer as a process in the body, and the tumor is the end product of that process. So we all have cancer cells within us, and the reason that cancer or tumor develops is because the body is not able to properly regulate those cancer cells. It can't regulate itself. And there's basically a characteristics or a certain terrain that happens within the body that would allow those cancer cells to be able to grow within the body. One is that the terrain is in a more acidic terrain. So that terrain is just slightly more acidic than it should be. And that's a terrain that helps to foster that cancer growth. And another thing that needs to happen is that we have to have a lowered immune system. So the immune system is our defense mechanism. So if our defenses are down, then that will allow cancer cells to be able to grow. And the other challenge is that if we have a challenged detoxification pathway, so we have detox pathways that aren't working at their best, then this will set up an environment that again lets cancer cells be able to grow. So we've set up a terrain that allows cancer cells to be able to grow. So what we're doing in biological medicine is that we are trying to create an internal environment that doesn't foster cancer growth, that instead fosters healing. It allows the body to properly regulate itself, and we allow the body to be able to self-heal. So this is definitely a very different approach to seeing cancer than you'll see in the conventional model. Now, what I've done is I've just broken it down into like three main components to treating hormonal cancer. First of all, we need to clean up the terrain. We have to create a healthy terrain that doesn't allow cancer cells to be able to grow and flourish. We also have to become metabolically healthy. And metabolic health is also very important in terms of cancer care because there is metabolically, we could be supporting cancerous terrain, or we can be metabolically healthy, which is not allowing those cancer cells to be able to grow. And the other thing we need to do is we actually need to work on balancing hormones. And this concept is also very different from a biological perspective than it is from a conventional perspective or even a functional medicine perspective. Because a lot of people would say, okay, well, we just take measurements of hormones and we figure out which hormones are out of balance, and then we just give people the hormones that they need in order to balance them out. And our approach in terms of biological medicine is very different. So I'll go into that. So what we're going to start with is cleaning up the terrain. And this is a picture of like a very beautiful terrain. This is one of the tests that we do within our practice is something called dark field microscopy. And this is a very central practice to biological medicine, is that we're actually able, we take a prick of the fingertip, we look at the live blood cells underneath the microscope, and we can actually get a picture of what that terrain looks like. And, you know, patients don't typically come in with terrains that look like this picture that we're looking at here, but what we know is that this is our goal. This is what we're trying to, you know, we'll look at their blood up on the screen. I have it up on a nice big screen TV, and we'll say, okay, well, this is what your blood looks like, and we are going to take the steps necessary in order to shift your terrain to look more like the normal terrain, which is what I also have up on my wall. So, you know, part of that terrain is something called the microbiome. So the microbiome is this ecosystem of bacteria and fungus that live within our digestive tract. And this microbiome needs to have the appropriate diversity, so it needs to have proper diversity of the healthy bacteria in order for us to have normal functioning physiology. And then we also need a balance in terms of that microbiome. So we need a symbiotic balance between the healthy bacteria and what is often called unhealthy bacteria, but what they really are is they're just opportunistic bacteria. So we need a nice balance between those two. And what we find is that we actually need that, that good, healthy diversity, and we need that balance in that microbiome. And when we do that, that can actually have a profound effect on our physiology. And when that is altered, that will also affect our physiology in a negative way. And realizing that this microbiome is really a dynamic system. It's constantly changing and evolving. Now, this microbiome is one of our major barriers. And when we look at it, we're also trying to figure out, well, how are toxic loads actually making their way into this internal milieu and causing disturbances in terms of our terrain. And what's happening is that these exogenous or endogenous toxins are making their way into the blood. Then we have these different detox pathways. So we have the microbiome, which is an area of protection. We have the liver and the gallbladder. We have the kidneys, the lymphatic systems, the lungs, the skin. And if those are all working really well, then the toxins will actually move out of our body. But what happens is that when those systems aren't working at their best, then what can happen is that then we can get toxic loads that move into the internal milieu, into that extracellular space. And then from there, they start to accumulate, and then they can move into the cell, so intracellular space, and then they can also be affecting the DNA. So one of the major things is that we can have breaching of the intestinal walls. And this is another way that toxic loads can be making their way into our system. So we have these things called tight junctions that hold the cells that line our digestive tract together. And over time, they can get broken down or damaged. So then we end up with undigested food particles, microorganisms, toxins that can move from the digestive tract, so from the lumen of the digestive tract into the bloodstream. So this is another way that toxic loads are making their way into the bloodstream. So we have, when these toxic loads are actually moving into the bloodstream, what can happen is that the toxins will now cause a huge inflammatory reaction because they really shouldn't be there. The body is seeing that toxic load as foreign. And when we're going to produce a whole bunch of inflammatory markers, and then those inflammatory molecules are going to now produce a large amount of protons, and this is actually going to create an acidic microenvironment. And when we have this acidic microenvironment, what happens is that the cell membranes actually lose their charge and the cells start to stick together. And we can see this underneath the microscope in this picture here. You can see the cells start to stick together. And the problem with that is that when these cells start to stick together, this is when we get anaerobic metabolism. So a healthy cell has aerobic metabolism, where it takes in glucose, it takes in oxygen, and then we can make ATP. We can make healthy energy for that cell. Now, with anaerobic metabolism, we have a lack of oxygen, and you can see that when these cells are all stacked together, we can't get proper oxygen into those cells. So we just take in sugar, and we have a byproduct of lactate, but we don't have the oxygen in order to make the energy. So it's actually a very inefficient way to make energy, but it doesn't use oxygen, and we have a byproduct of lactic acid. So we have a byproduct of an acid that's happening within the cell. So this is when we ferment sugar as opposed to respirate oxygen. And what you can see in terms of that pH of the microenvironment is that you can see they actually show, the healthy a healthy cell, the pH is between 7.3 to 7.4, and a cancerous microenvironment is actually just slightly more acidic. And the other thing that you'll note when you look at this picture here is the actual cell membrane. So you can see that the cell membrane looks nice and regular with the normal cell. And then when you look at those cancerous cells, it looks very irregular. And we, again, can see this when we look at it underneath the microscope. You can see that the cell membranes can be damaged and they're just not perfectly round. And this happens when you get a lot of inflammation that's happening within the cell. Now, the challenge with this, when those cell membranes are damaged, is that embedded in those cell membranes are thousands of hormone receptors. So when we have a disruption in those cell membranes, it can actually be disrupting our hormonal system. So, the way that we work on fixing hormonal problems is not by just throwing a whole bunch of hormones into the system. It's actually by helping to fix these cell membranes and fixing this terrain. So this is how we differ a bit in terms of when we're looking at hormonal cancer pictures. Now, just going back, you're realizing that in order for any sort of a pathology to happen is that it's multi-causal. It's not just one problem, but you can see the cascade that happens is that you have a stimuli, so it can be any of those stressors, and then they cause a whole bunch of inflammation. Then we get a fibrosis that happens. Then it creates that precancerous microenvironment, and then we get that transition from a normal cell to a cancerous cell. And this is really the progression, just putting that all together for you, is that we get those toxins coming into the blood. If we have a breakdown of those major detoxification pathways, if they're not working well, then that toxic load moves into that extracellular space. It produces a ton of inflammation. With that ton of inflammation, we produce a ton of protons, which produces that acidic environment. That acidic environment makes it so that those cell membranes, they lose their charge. So they lose their charge. We get damage to those cell membranes, which also damages that hormonal receptors. The cells start to stick together. When they stick together, then we don't have enough oxygen that's in for cellular metabolism. So then we have an anaerobic cellular metabolism. So a cellular metabolism without oxygen, and that produces that tumor microenvironment. So there is that progression. So what we see is that common characteristics in terms of a cancerous terrain is that we see chronic inflammation, we see an overload on those detox pathways, we see a suppression of the immune system, an acidic environment, a hypoxic cellular terrain, and that anaerobic metabolism. And when we do a lot of our treatments are really focused on all of these areas. Our treatments are really focused on cleaning up this toxic internal milieu. So the approach is really, we first of all want to decrease the inflammation, so we got to figure out what's causing those stressors. We need to heal the lining of the digestive tract, so those tight junctions. We need to build a healthy microbiome. We need to support the pathways of detoxification, and we need to help to reestablish a proper immune system, because that immune system is our defense mechanism. So how we're going to do this is that, first of all, we need to identify and remove those causes of inflammation. So I go through the 6 stressors on the body are foods, environmental toxins, heavy metals, infectious agents, anything structural, so any of those mechanical stressors, and then we always can't forget those emotional stressors. So it's identifying and removing those stressors on the body. And diet is huge. I think that we can't really make changes if we don't make an effort to change the diet. So we need to avoid the gluten, the cow's dairy, the refined sugar, the industrial oils. We need to eat organic, so we're removing a large amount of that toxic load. And the other thing that can aid this process along is to have things that help to alkalinize the milieu. So doing things like the Alcala powder and the basic tabs. And then what can also help is the like Pleo Sanuvis and Pleo Citro. And what they are is they're organic acids, and they actually help to remove the more pathological acids within the cells, which is very important and very effective in terms of alkalinizing that terrain. And the other thing that we'd want to do is that we want to use some systemic protolytic enzymes. And what the enzymes help to do is that they break down proteins, inflammatory factors, and they can also break down cancer cells. But the important part is that these protolytic enzymes have to be taken away from food. If you take them with food, they'll help to break down the foods you're eating. But if you take them between meals, they help to break down those inflammatory factors. So this plays a very key role, and there's actually a ton of research on protolytic enzymes and breaking down cancer cells. So this is a key step as well. And then what we need to do is we need to work on healing up the lining of the digestive tract. So you got to make sure that we're giving the body the building blocks in order to do the repair of the lining. So you need to have some healthy fats in the diet. And then there's supplements like the NAG that actually help to repair the tight junctions. So this is a huge part to me as well. We need to repair those tight junctions in order to make sure that the lining of the digestive tract is healed up. Because it's hard to heal that immune system that's living on the other side of our digestive tract if we just keep having these holes in our digestive tract. And then another part of it is we need to make sure that we balance the microbiome. So balancing the microbiome is putting high-quality probiotics into the gut, and then we also need to we could take some of the natural probiotics, and then we need prebiotics. So prebiotics are the food for the healthy bacteria. So we need to always be giving the body the prebiotics so that we can start to really multiply those probiotics in the gut. So balancing out that microbiome is also a huge component to healing the gut, realizing that, 80% of your immune system is housed in your digestive tract. And then we need to support the organs of detoxification. Now, the challenge is that if you have stagnation of the detox pathways, but really stagnation of the lymphatic system, then what we have is toxic accumulation happening in the body. If we can't move those toxins out of the body, then toxins are just staying in our system and continuing to cause a toxic terrain. And we need to make sure that those pathways of detoxification are working well. And, the drainage remedies are huge. I think that they're really a missing piece in terms of when we talk about detoxification, because the drainage is what moves the toxic loads out at a cellular level, and you have to get that toxic load out of that extracellular space in order for you to even start to get things to move into the cell so that we can get proper cellular function. You got to clean up that space outside of the cells, and that's what these drainage remedies help to do. And then we have to reestablish that immune system. And, just on the other side of that, digestive tract is a big part of the GALT, so the gut-associated lymphatic tissue and part of that is the Byers patch. And that's a big part of the immune system. And the pleorebus is an excellent organotherapy of the Byers patch, which helps to just re-educate the immune system and strengthen that immune system so that we can get that immune system that is, and for anyone who does have cancer, they don't have a strong immune system. So we have to re-establish that proper immune system. So this is an important step as well. So again, to just kind of review how we're going to clean up that terrain is that we're going to decrease the inflammation, we're going to heal up the lining of the digestive tract, we're going to build a healthy microbiome, we're going to improve those pathways of detoxification, and then we're going to reestablish proper function of the immune system. And then the next step is going to is for us to become metabolically flexible or metabolically healthy, but part of that is that flexibility. So we need to be able to use both glucose and ketones, and we need to be training our body to be able to do this and use them both as needed. Now, what we know is that actually 87.8, so close to 90% of Americans are metabolically inflexible. So that means that our bodies aren't able to properly use glucose and ketones are the breakdown products of fats, and glucose is basically using sugars as energy sources. So if we go back to the Warburg effect, which, he talks about the anaerobic metabolism, which is the healthy metabolism, versus the aerobic metabolism versus the anaerobic metabolism, which is what the cancer cells do. And what happens is that the healthy metabolism needs sugar, and so does the cancerous cells. But when you take something called ketones, which is the breakdown products of fats, then the cancer cells aren't able to use ketones, whereas the healthy cells can. So if we can change over our metabolism to using ketones, then this is one way that we cannot be feeding cancer cells. And we have some studies that actually support this, is that they've looked at using ketone supplementation with, I believe that these are rats or mice, and what they found is that when they gave them these diets, that they actually decreased the tumors, and you can see pictures of that. What I found interesting in the study is that with the study, they were supplementing with ketones, but they were still feeding them a standard diet that was about 60% carbohydrates. And I wonder if they actually fed them a ketogenic diet that had low amounts of carbohydrates, if these results would actually be even better. But that was just my curiosity of reading into the data. But you can see that definitely the ketones were helpful in terms of cancer treatments. And the other key factor here is like this insulin resistance picture in cancer. And so what we have is that when we have the toxic load, so either endogenous toxins or exogenous toxins or mental emotional stressors, what happens is that it activates a part of our system called the HPA axis, so the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. And when that gets stimulated, our body produces cortisol from the adrenals anytime we have any sort of stress response. And, I think a lot of people think when they think of stressors, they're just thinking of mental emotional stress. But, when we have stressors coming into our bodies, including, eating the wrong foods, we have an infectious agent coming into our body, we have heavy metals or toxic loads coming into our body, it elicits a whole stress response. and that will make us produce cortisol. And when we have cortisol, we produce insulin, and then when we have a high amount of the cortisol and insulin being released, then this can contribute to an insulin resistance. And with the insulin resistance, this means that the glucose isn't actually getting into the cells to make energy. So what happens is that we actually end up with a high amount of sugars in the microenvironment. And those high amounts of sugars can be feeding our cancer cells. So this is why fasting, low carb, or ketogenic diet can be beneficial in terms of helping with that insulin resistant picture and also helping with that microenvironment and bringing down those sugars in the microenvironment. And there's another connection that I also found interesting, because I always think of insulin resistance as being high in sugar. So it's also interesting to see that stress can contribute to that insulin resistant picture. But the other thing that can contribute to that insulin resistant picture is if we are consuming dietary linolenic acid. And what these are is these are your omega-6 industrial oils. And what is shown is that there's a connection between consuming these industrial oils and insulin resistance. So these are a list of some of those industrial oils really that we want to be avoiding because they are contributing to an insulin resistant picture, which is what we don't want in terms of setting up a cancerous picture. And fasting has also been shown to be a contributing factor to helping with decreasing cancer growth. They've actually shown that with fasting, you can see that with fasting, we actually see a decrease in terms of that tumor growth, which I think is really promising research, because I think that incorporating fasting or something like a ketogenic diet is definitely can be beneficial in terms of cancer care. And so, like, how do we achieve this diet-wise? One of the major things is trying to remove the grains. And one of the major problems with grains is that as soon as we eat grains, they turn to sugars right away. But there's other problems with grains. A lot of grains can contain some toxic loads like mycotoxins, and they can also contain something called lectins. And with lectins, what we see is that those lectins are the plant's defense mechanisms. And when we consume them, sometimes they can be causing problems in terms of how we're able to properly absorb them. So those lectins can definitely be a contributing factor to why grains are problematic. And another problem food is cow's dairy. So cow's dairy, the major problem with cow's dairy is that casein A1. So that casein A1 is we just can't effectively break it down, so it causes inflammation in our body. The other problem with cow's dairy is the hormones in it, the antibiotics that's typically added to it. With the pasteurization, it's heating up. So basically, it denatures anything that could be beneficial to us. So avoiding cow's dairy is going to be beneficial, and there's lots of things that we can replace it with, from organic grass-fed butter to that's the dairy that I'm actually okay with because that's the fat component of it. We can be having goat or sheep dairy, rice, almond, coconut, any of the nut milks. So there's lots of replacements for it. We want to be avoiding the unhealthy fats. So these are the industrial oils that we should not be having in our diet, as well as those trans fats. So we know that it as the margarine, but when you read through labels, it can be listed as hydrogenated fats or partly hydrogenated oils. And then we want to be incorporating a lot of those good, healthy fats into the diet. And we want to be staying away from the more unclean proteins, so the industrial meats, because they tend to be fed corn and grains, and usually they're GMOs. Industrial meats are just very different from our grass-fed organic meats. They are actually shown to be more inflammatory in the body. We want to be staying away from the processed meats, the farmed fish, and limit the seafood, and that's just because they tend to have a higher toxic load. And what we want to be consuming is we want to be consuming clean proteins. And those clean proteins are the organic grass-fed meats, wild game. So if you are a hunter, these are some good ones to be taking in. Organic chicken and eggs, raw nuts, seeds, the bone broth, the collagen. And in terms of carbohydrates, I think when most people think of carbohydrates, they don't realize that vegetables are carbohydrates. So you want to be having a lot of those healthy vegetables. You want to be having the seaweeds and the herbs and the fermented foods. And an interesting one is also those resistant starches. So those resistant starches are, they're when they get into, they don't get broken down like regular starches. They actually go right into the intestines, and they are food for the healthy bacteria. So and what they are is they are like cooked beans, or they can even be rice or sweet potatoes that have been cooked, cooled, and you can either eat them cooled or you can reheat them. But that's how you create those resistant starches. Now, one of the things that I do with my patients is we try to get patients into these different ranges, in that they've shown that in terms of that metabolic health, that if we can get their ketones into this GKI of like 1 to 3, we can get them into that keto therapeutic range. So what it means is that we're measuring their glucose and they're measuring their ketones, and we're trying to get that ratio to 1 to 3. And in that ratio, and it's often challenging to get into, but what they've shown in the research is they've actually shown when they're in that keto therapeutic range that this is really a therapeutic treatment for cancer. So this is one of the things that we're aiming for in our treatments, and that will help with that metabolic health. And the next thing we want to do is we want to work on balancing hormones. Now, I think what's really important to understand is that there are hormone-disrupting chemicals that we come across on a regular basis that we really want to be eliminating from our lives, and because what's happening is that this can be a major component of what is disturbing our hormone balance. And so, there's the regular ones that like hormone replacement and the birth control pill can be big disruptors in terms of our normal hormone balance. But then there's also that a lot of those animal proteins have been injected with hormones. Our vegetables have been sprayed with pesticides, or the pesticides have estrogen-like properties. And then there's lots of things in our environment. Plastics are a big one that we'll come across, and we come across it in a lot of our day-to-day activities. So we want to try to identify those and try to remove them because they are throwing off our natural hormone balance. And the other one is heavy metals. And heavy metals coming into our environment, heavy metals are a known endocrine disruptor. So they are disturbing our natural hormone balance. And often a question that I'll get asked is about the differences between the synthetic hormones, our natural hormones, and our phyto hormones, because sometimes this is a huge mix-up, is that people kind of get scared of the phyto hormones when they have a hormonal cancer. And what we need to be staying away from is we need to be staying away from the synthetic hormones. Synthetic hormones, what they are, I think of them as like, you think of those hormone receptors as sort of like parking spaces. And those synthetic hormones, they bind really strongly to those receptors. So it's like they go into those parking spots and they don't move. And then whereas our natural hormones, like they cycle in and out of those receptors. So they go into those receptors, they do their job, and then they cycle out. So sort of like those parking spots, right? People go into those parking spots and then they come out. They don't sit there all day and night. And then our phyto hormones, which are the hormones that come from our plants, they have similar binding, so they'll bind to those receptors, into those natural receptor sites, but they're weakly bound, and so they will go in, they'll do a job, and then they'll move out, but they will bind weakly and they move easily. And they are typically not problematic as those synthetic hormones. So I really think that when people have hormonal cancers, they don't need to be scared of the phyto hormones, and that's what's causing the disruption in terms of their hormone balance. So another component that's really important to know in terms of the connection in terms of hormonal picture is that the liver makes cholesterol, and cholesterol is the building block of all the hormones in your body. So it makes the hormones for your ovaries or testes, and it makes the hormones for your thyroid, and it makes the hormones for your adrenals. So the liver functioning well plays a huge role in terms of our hormonal balance. And if we have a congested liver, so if we have a liver that's not working at its best, that's overloaded, then this can contribute to a hormonal imbalance in the body. So no matter what, the liver needs to be able to effectively neutralize and eliminate hormonal metabolites. And we can also have issues in terms of digestion because if our bowels aren't moving very well, again, our bowels are a way to move out those hormonal metabolites out of the body. And if we are backed up, like we're having constipation, then what our body does is it actually will reabsorb those hormonal metabolites through something called enterohepatic circulation. So we got to make sure that the bowels are moving well in order for us to have good hormonal balance. And the other thing that needs to happen is that our gut microbiome needs to be in good balance because the microbiome actually produces an enzyme called beta-glucuronidase, and it helps to convert the estrogens into its active form. So we need that good bacteria in order for us to have balance of our estrogen levels. And the other thing that we need to have in order to have good hormonal balance is that we need proper fat metabolism because we need fats in order to make hormones. So there's a lot that goes into proper hormonal balance. It's not just a matter of just giving people a hormone replacement. And so some of the tactics to improve fat metabolism is for us to chew slowly, to take some choline sources, to have fermented foods, to incorporate bitters, and Cardis. And Cardis has been shown to really support proper bile flow. And when we have proper bile flow, we can have proper fat metabolism. And what we often see is an estrogen dominance. And, here's a list of all the different things that we see in women that can contribute to that estrogen dominant picture. And with that estrogen dominant picture, you see everything from weight gain to fibrocystic breasts. We see fibroids, endometriosis, fatigue. You see that with everything. But there's a number of different signs that we're seeing some estrogen dominance, and we see this in men as well. We'll see this with the enlarged breasts with men. We see that with sexual dysfunction, and we also see it with like infertility, and we have fertility issues with women as well when there's an estrogen dominant picture. And there is definitely some women who have that estrogen dominant phenotype. They just have a higher density of estrogen receptors in the breasts, the hips, the thighs, and you'll see this typically will show up as like a woman who just has like a more curvaceous kind of phenotype. And it's just what happens is that they just metabolize estrogens preferentially. So they'll easily convert their progesterones into estrogens. And one of the signs that we see in terms of symptoms is that we'll see that breast tenderness happening before their menstruation. So that'll tell us that they're bioaccumulating some of those estrogens. And this is a challenging one because estrogen, it gets produced in a number of cells, but where estrogen can really accumulate is in our adipose cells. And so the more adipose cells that we have, the more estrogen we produce, and then the more fat we store. So it ends up being a bit of a vicious cycle in terms of weight gain and high estrogens in the body. And another challenge point in terms of that balance of the estrogen and progesterone is that when we have high stress, what will happen is that the body will then take progesterone and make it into cortisol, and then that throws off that delicate balance between that estrogen and progesterone. And I love to look at these pathways because it really helps to show how things get shifted. So you see the pregnenolone, instead of being made into progesterone, that it gets made into cortisol. And then you can also see how things are shifting in terms of being made into estrogen or made into testosterone. So I find that these steroid pathways are very interesting to watch how the body's converting your hormones. There's also a connection between the thyroid and estrogen connection, is that when you have high estrogens in the body, then this can interfere with our thyroid hormones. Specifically, like the synthetic estrogens can be affecting the thyroid hormones. When we see a high amount of the estrogens, it can be an antagonist to the thyroid hormones. So then we'll see basically a slowdown in the metabolic rate, and that'll lead to some weight gain. So high amounts of synthetic estrogens can definitely be impacting the function of the thyroid. And one of the ways that we are kind of evaluating thyroid hormonal balance is especially for women who are in their reproductive years, is we are figuring out what their ideal menstruation is. And so this is the ideal menstruation, and then if we have anything that's outside of this ideal, then we know that their hormones are out of balance. So it's definitely easier to figure out hormonal imbalances in menstruating or reproductive aged females. There's other ways for us to look at hormones. We can do it through blood, we can do it through saliva, we can do it through urine. And there's definitely advantages and disadvantages of both of these. When we look at it through blood, it's looking at bound and unbound hormones. So sometimes it doesn't necessarily give us an accurate reading of where those hormones are at. the saliva, what it's looking at is it's looking at actually the bioavailable hormones. So we get an idea of which hormones are actually available and active and able to be used by the body. And whereas, the blood hormones will group those both together. And then what the urine is able to do is it'll tell us about the bioavailable hormones, but it also tells us how the body is actually using those hormones by measuring those hormone metabolites. So I do find it's definitely a more expensive test, but checking the hormones through the urine it gives me a lot more information in terms of the hormone balance and what your body's doing with it. And one of the tests I use will be the Dutch test, and you can actually see how the body's actually converting those estrogens. And ideally, you want those estrogens to predominantly be making it into the 2-hydroxy, and then it makes some of the 4-hydroxy and 16-hydroxy, but you want it to be predominantly that 2. And so the challenge is that when you make it into the 4 or the 16, that's more inflammatory. And the 4 even, if it's not being properly, if those metabolites aren't being properly detoxified and moved out of the body, they can actually be causing damage to the DNA. So this is, understanding that these estrogen hormones, they're actually a potent DNA transcriber, right? So they can actually affect. So what happens is that those estrogens will bind to your estrogen receptors. They move into the cytoplasm, into the nucleus, and they can actually turn on and off genes. So estrogens can actually play a big effect in terms of how the DNA is being actually affected within those cells. So that's why we really want to be paying attention to how those metabolites are actually being shifted and converted in the body. So that's a good test for us to be able to see how things are being shifted. So this kind of gives you a summary of those estrogen metabolites. Ideally, you want them to be 60 to 80%. You want them to be those 2-hydroxy, and then the 16-hydroxy and the 4-hydroxy are more the inflammatory ones. And so if your body is converting more into these problematic ones, then that can set you up for potentially not to scare people who are doing the testing and are showing that, but that can shift people into that more cancerous picture, or just even that more inflammatory picture where you see that PMS, fibroids, endometriosis picture. But you can see how the body's shifting. So ways that we want to treat this hormonal imbalance is that we, first of all, want to decrease the amount of synthetic hormones that we're taking into the body. So we want to be avoiding hormone replacement and the birth control pill. We want to consume organic meat so that we're decreasing the synthetic hormones we're taking in through the meat, and we want to be taking in organic vegetables, so we decrease the pesticides that have estrogen properties to them. And then we also want to be realizing that our hormones are actually messengers between cells. And so what's important is that we need to actually be, in order for those hormones to work appropriately, we need to clean up the area around the cells. And I find that this is an area that doesn't really get talked about when we talk about hormone balancing, but those hormones can't properly communicate if we have a high amount of toxic load in that extracellular space. So that's where these drainage remedies really come in. The Hepatica and the Solidago and the Lymphodrop, these drainage remedies are so important for cleaning up the extracellular space in order to allow the hormones to be able to properly communicate. And again, in terms of regulation of the hormones, I think this is such an important factor to understand, is that the regulation regulation doesn't happen by just adding hormones to the body, but what we need to do is we need to be supporting the natural process of hormones within the body, and that's what these remedies so beautifully do. In terms of the female tonic, it's really good at balancing out those female hormones. It increases the circulation to the female hormones. It calms the nervous system. It stimulates the liver function, increases the kidney function, so those major organs of detoxification. Cardis, again, it's working really effectively at supporting the liver and the gallbladder. And remember, that liver needs to be functioning really well because it needs to be able to get rid of those excess hormone metabolites, including those estrogen metabolites. The LAPA is just overall a good blood cleanser as well as that metabolic cleanser. So it's cleaning up the liver, the lymphatics, the kidneys. And then there's another great remedy, one of the pleos is the pleo chrysosan. And what it is it's an organotherapy made from the placenta, and it's actually very good at balancing out those sex hormones and improving that cellular respiration. So I talked about how that we need to improve that cellular respiration in terms of metabolic health, and so this is one that helps in that process as well. And then, in terms of that hormone balance, we look at the female hormones, but we also need to also look at the adrenals and the thyroid because they all play a role in terms of that whole cascade. So in terms of supporting the adrenals, we can do that. I love the glandulars. So the glandulars really help to support those adrenals. And then thyroid, when you're looking at the thyroid, we can do that with the biothy and the lycopus. And the lycopus, when you have a low functioning thyroid, you want to have like a higher dose, and when you have that high functioning thyroid, then you do the lycopus at a lower dose. But again, what it's doing is it's helping to detox the actual thyroid gland and increase blood flow to that area. That's the benefit of these drainage remedies, is that they're detoxing the actual tissues and the cells, the area around those cells, and also increasing blood flow to the area. And then I think another such an important factor as well is understanding the role that sleep plays in terms of balancing hormones. So understanding that hormones actually have a circadian rhythm. So we need quality sleep in order to regulate our circadian rhythms and in order to balance our hormones. So understanding that we need proper sleep in order for us to have good hormonal balance. So that's where good sleep hygiene comes in. So it's everything from, going to bed at the same time, waking up at the same time. It's all this sleep hygiene we always talk about, but we always have to go back to basics, right? So it's sleeping in that pitch black room, the quiet room, the temperature that's slightly below room temperature. You want to turn the screens off. You want to stop eating 3 to 4 hours before you go to bed, stop that caffeine at 2, and have that soothing routine. So that sleep hygiene is going to actually help to balance your hormones. And these are just some additional therapies that we offer within our clinic. And again, all of them are really addressing cleaning up that terrain, helping to improve detox pathways, helping to improve the immune system. All of these things will address getting the body back into balance, so the body is able to do its self-healing mechanisms. All right, so I think I made it through right on time. I know that was a lot of information, so thank you so much for hanging in there with me, and I hope you found this all very helpful. And that's how to reach me. So thank you very much, Biomed, for having me, and if you need to reach me, these are all the outlets probably the place I hang out the most is on Instagram, and then my website has really all my information. So thank you so much, and I will hand over the mic to Heather.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Roberts. You did it. You got all of that information done in an hour, almost exactly. So
that
I think
was my goal.
2 minutes to spare. So, and it was great. Like, I mean, and so with the presentation slides, if people want to dive in a little bit further, you definitely have the notes in there as well, so that if there's points that they wanted to expand upon, then you did provide that information, so that's great as well.
Awesome.
All right, so question and answer time. We've had a few questions come in through the chat and through the Q&A section. So if you have any questions for Dr. Roberts, now's the time to ask. And so type them into the chat room or type them into the Q&A section, and we'll take about 10 minutes to go through and answer anything that's come up. Okay, so we've got lots of questions here about food. But before we get there, a different question just about pH and terrain. And so Dr. Kesswetter, she was asking, what is the optimal pH when you're talking about alkalizing the terrain?
Again, that's a challenging question because pH is, you have to look at a number of things when you're looking at pH. You should actually be looking at, because there's so many factors that go into pH, you need to be looking at blood, urine, and saliva and looking at them all together because, so I don't have an exact answer because the thing is that, if that urine pH is, it should be high in the, it should be more acidic in the morning because that's the body's way of moving acidity out of the body. So sometimes people will say, oh, well, I checked my urine pH and it's really acidic. And I'm like, well, that's good because that means your body's actually getting rid of the toxic load. So, and then sometimes what can happen is that, say if you look at, our blood is also, it's between that really narrow range, but sometimes what can happen is that if we have if your blood is actually more acidic, sometimes that can mean that the terrain within your cells might be more alkaline, but the extracellular space is more acidic. So I think that you have to actually look at more like a biological terrain assessment to figure that out, and you have to be looking at, those urine, saliva, and blood, and how they interact with each other.
Yeah,
so that's my non-answer.
That's the hallmark for pH, is the biological terrain and analysis or assessment. And there's a chart, isn't there? I've seen the chart before, and it's very, very complicated. But when you do the three assessments together, then it places you onto this chart to kind of assess where people are at.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I know for a lot of practitioners, they use urinary pH to give some ideas about where the tissue acidosis, or how much acid is being stored in the tissue level of the body. So if the urine is extremely acidic in the morning, in that, like below a 6.0 or 5.8, then that can indicate that there's a lot of excess acid in the tissue. And then if it doesn't bounce up to 6.8 to 7.4 during the day, it stays below that, another indication of tissue acidosis. I know from SANM and with biological medicine, that's one of the ways to do some tracking if you need an easy way just to figure out what you're doing, and kind of for at least with the alkalizing portion of it. Okay, so let me just see here. So, okay, that was the only pH question. Okay, so next, for Lycopus, do you have any experience using Lycopus with Hashimoto's or not using it at all with Hashimoto's?
Yeah, so I do have experience using it with Hashimoto's, and I will use it with Hashimoto's. Like I think that sometimes people get nervous with like the autoimmune pictures, and they're like, well, what supplements can I use with autoimmune? And yeah, I have no problems using Lycopus with Hashimoto's. I actually also have no problems giving people who have Hashimoto's iodine and selenium and zinc, because they need those minerals in order to turn on this thyroid and get it to work. So yes, I would definitely be using the Lycopus in Hashimoto's picture.
All right, thank you. We've got a whole bunch of food questions, so I'm going to actually take those until a little bit later.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on using thymus extract or homeopathics to boost the immune system in cancer patients?
Yeah, and so those are things that I'm not hesitant to do. Once we've done the groundwork in terms of supporting, like I actually really like using the glandulars, the organotherapies in order to boost the immune system. Yeah, I think that, again, you have to do the groundwork. You have to be opening up pathways of detoxification. You need to be balancing out the microbiome. You need to be cleaning up the diet and removing major inflammatory stressors on the body. But when you do that groundwork, then you can do the immune boosting therapies. Yeah, I'm not hesitant to do any of the immune boosting therapies in a cancerous picture, and I know that's a challenging. I know that challenges the conventional approach, in that the conventional approach is all about shutting down the immune system, and I just see the immune system so differently. I see the immune system as that we need to support the body's like own immune system, and when we make that our own immune system stronger, then our body is able to handle cancer cells a lot better. So yes, I'll use those.
All right. Thank you. And so then a next question is, do you know if there's any hormonal component connection with lichen sclerosis?
Sorry, lichen
sclerosis.
Sclerosis.
And this one we can take this one outside of this conversation to answer for Emily if necessary.
I'm just trying to.
Chronic inflammatory skin disorder.
Okay. Sorry. So what's the question?
Is there a hormonal? Okay. Is there a
hormonal component to it? Yeah, I would say that there can be, just because, like anytime we see a skin condition, the skin condition can tell us that the primary organs of detoxification, so the liver and the kidneys, that they're not working at their best. And then if we have a liver that's not working at its best, then you can also see a hormonal imbalance. So definitely with a chronic skin inflammatory issue, you can also see hormonal imbalances as a contributing factor as well. Yeah, for sure. So
Okay.
it means focus on the liver.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Okay, and so now the rest of these questions tend to be food questions. So let's go through these last couple. Is white rice better than brown rice, as in gluten is not good for us? However, my understanding is rice, including brown rice, is not gluten
Yeah,
related.
so they both shouldn't contain gluten. And yeah, so I know, like, in my original learning, and it shows you how much you evolve. But I used to always think that the brown rice was the healthier version. But as you kind of dive into learning about lectins, then you see that the white rice is actually probably a better version because it has less lectins in it. And then I love the idea of making the rice into more of a resistant starch. So instead of it being a grain that will turn to sugar right away, that if you cook it, cool it, and then consume it, then it's actually a resistant starch. So it's food for those healthy bacteria. So I think that's actually the healthiest way for us to be consuming rice, and white rice would be a healthier option, believe it or not.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Sometimes these talks are all about giving people different perspectives on things.
Yes.
Talking about lectins, is there a concern about legumes and lectins?
So, yeah, when you look at those, like, I think that what they're showing is that if we cook them, and specifically if we can pressure cook them, then the lectin load is quite low. So that's really what you want to do in order to consume them, and then they're not a problem for us to be eating.
Okay, that's a very good tip, actually. Cook them first.
Yes.
And with rice, cook it first, cool it, and then either eat it cool or warm it back up and eat it.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. So I've got two more questions here. What are your thoughts on bioidentical hormone use?
So, in a lot of cases, I'm okay with bioidentical hormones. I would much rather people are on bioidentical hormones than they're on synthetic hormones. But I think that you also have to realize that bioidentical hormones still aren't really treating the root cause of issues. But I think that what bioidentical hormones can help to do is they can act as a really nice bridge. So, if a person is feeling really bad, like, say for example, someone is getting like quite severe hot flashes and it's affecting their sleep and their quality of life, with the bioidentical hormones, it can help to calm down those hot flashes and get them sleeping well, while you treat the underlying cause, which might be that you need to get their liver functioning better, balance out their gut flora, and get their gut in better health, and then so you get it helps to treat those symptoms right away, and then while you treat the underlying cause, and then eventually you may be able to take them off of those bioidentical hormones because they won't need them because you've treated some of the causative factors. So that's typically how I like to use bioidentical hormones. So as more of that bridge than as a solution.
All right, perfect. One quick question about avocado oil. What are your thoughts on using it for cooking?
I like avocado oil for cooking. I think it's a great one for cooking. It definitely has a higher heating point or temperature point than olive oil, so it is a better one to be cooking with. Yeah. So I like.
Great. And then there's quite a few questions here, so I want to just ask it as a broad question for you.
Okay.
Regarding, it's about food again. And just to preface this, you are a lecturer with Paracelsus Clinic and talking about biological medicine, and so this is something I know you're very steeped very deeply in as far as how you practice and where you took how you practice in general. So I've had a bunch of questions coming up through here about animal protein, and with the understanding that some of the original biological medicine teachings was going more in a plant-based diet. And so I was just going to just ask kind of on your final thoughts on that. Plant-based diet versus some meat or eggs kind of within that.
Okay, yeah, so I would say that, I'm very supportive of plant-based diet, but I think that through my learning and education is that it's just learning that there's a big difference between industrial meats and grass-fed organic meats. Like they are basically like two different species in a sense, that are industrial meats, which is what most people in our population are consuming. And that's also like what the research on meat is typically done, is that it's typically, and you know, when the research shows that meat is problematic, it's showing it's people consuming industrial meats. And if you look at the composition of grass-fed organic meats, they're completely different compositions. So they just have higher amounts of omega-3s. Your grass-fed organic meats have something called CLA, which helps with your metabolic health, and then the nutrient value of it is a lot higher too, because these animals are eating what they were designed to eat. So this is really one of the things that made me realize that just having that, because of this, people can be consuming really not large amounts, but small amounts of clean proteins and their systems, and it allows the body to actually have some of those nutrients in really bioavailable forms, and that our bodies can actually our body can handle it very well, and it can be part of a healthy diet. So I would say that the diet would be plant-based with really clean meats, and if you can't do clean meats, then you want to just stay plant-based. So yeah, that's my take on it, and I hope that explanation helps.
Great. Thank you for offering and sharing your take on it. And so one last question, which I think would be very useful on this topic, is for your protocols. Do you start it with patients during chemo, or do you wait until there's a break in chemo or until they're finished with the chemo?
So I will start these protocols when they're on chemo, but you have to realize that those chemotherapy agents are quite strong, and you have to, while they're doing chemo, you have to do a lot of supportive therapy to ensure that those chemo agents move out of their body, and this is really important to understand for practitioners and for patients, is that if you are not opening up those detox pathways, then people can just get a lot sicker with chemotherapy. So, whichever whatever therapy you're using to break down cancer cells, you have to make sure that their pathways of detoxification are open and able to effectively move that toxic load and those breakdown products of the cancer cells effectively out of the body. So this is, very important in terms of cancer care is whether you're supporting them through chemo or whether you're even using like some of the stuff we use in our therapy is like something called local hypothermia, which is using high heats to break down cancer cells. And with that, even that, like if we're not using therapies that help to open up pathways of detoxification, we can be making patients sicker. So it needs to be paired together.
Great. That I think is a really wonderful way to end off the webinar and stressing that importance no matter which way a patient is going as far as cancer care, that you're supporting them and making sure those detox pathways are open so that whatever techniques are being used are going to be able to be as effective as possible without getting anybody sicker.
Yes, exactly, for sure.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, Dr. Roberts, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation that you did tonight on the biological medicine approach to hormonal cancers. There was so much information and so much to learn, and so Biomed really appreciates that you're taking the time to share with us your clinical expertise and all your years of working with patients. Very, very much appreciated. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak.
Mm-hmm. And until next time, thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. All right, everybody, take care. Bye-bye.